a good weekend, Bill? No, busy. And go down wrong.
Welcome, councillors.
Shit all over the place.
Kia ora, Chair. Mayor Goff, welcome, Chair, and Independent Māori Statutory Board Member Tauhanari, welcome. Welcome to members of the public media for this meeting of the Planning Committee today, the 28th of March. Almost change in season. So we've got quite a full agenda today. The agenda is supported by quite a lot of information that has been workshopped that you can see on the attachment agenda, if we can call it that, electronically. So members, if you could make sure when we're looking at particular items, it's not just that report, it's your attendance, participation in the workshops that support that item and the documentation that was tabled on that day at workshops in support of those respective items. I'll go to apologies. Welcome Director of Strategy Jim Quinn and Secretariat as well. So I'll go to apologies, and I have apologies from Councillor Kathy Casey and Councillor Dick Quacks for absence, Councillor Linda Cooper for lateness on council business, and for Mayor Phil Goff and Councillor Fesso Collins for early departure, and I think I have Councillor Ross Clow for early departure and Wayne Walker for lateness.
Mr. Chair, I will be coming back, but I have to propose a toast at the Prime Minister's luncheon for the Chinese Premier, so it's not something I can easily get out of. Otherwise, I would be absolutely committed to being part of your committee all the way through.
I realise, and the Premier of China is in Auckland today, members, the second most important leader in China, so it is important that the Mayor and also Councillor Clow attend that today. So thank you. I'll move receipt of those apologies. Do I have a second?
Yes, second.
Thank you. Councillor Simpson, I think I heard. All those in favour say aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. Members, are there any declarations on any item under 2? I have a declaration from Councillor Sharon Stewart for item C1 on the public excluded agenda. Are there any other declarations? No. There being none, we'll note the interest of Councillor Sharon Stewart. Thank you, Councillor Stewart. Confirmation of minutes. I'll move the motion to accept those minutes of the 7th of February, of March. Do I have a second? Yep. Councillor Clow. All those in favour say aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. I have received no petitions, so I'll go to 5. There have been 2 requests to participate under public input. I've accepted 1 from a group that I will mention very briefly. There was a request this morning at something like 7:30. I considered it too late. We have a very full agenda, so I've declined the second request for public input on those grounds, and I will now welcome Richard Didsbury, Shane Bulletich and Sir Stephen Tyndall to come up to the front table and microphones. And also welcome Julie Stout. Julie's coming too from Urban Auckland. Shane, you are a group joined up, and I know you're many groups in some ways. Would you like to introduce your colleagues and outline their representation?
Yes, happy to do that. So I represent Stop Stealing Our Harbour. Stephen Tyndall has been an avid supporter of that cause and is here today to support that and lend his opinions to it. Richard Didsbury is also an avid supporter and was involved in the Port Future study, as was I, and Committee for Auckland, and Julie Stout represents Urban Auckland, which led the charge on the original proposed extensions and was also on the Port Future study.
Thank you, Shane, and you've come to express your views on waterfront planning and implementation.
Correct.
So perhaps I'll lead. I'd like you all to reflect on every city in the world that you admire, because they were all based probably on water. They were based on a harbour or they were based on a river. And all the cities, I think, that are in your minds have now, the economic driver of the port has moved away from the city centre. So what Auckland's wrestling with the tension between its city and the harbour has been experienced by every other city that you admire, whether it's Europe, even in South America or Europe, all over the world. So what we're wrestling with as a community is not unusual. And last year, the council got a whole group of disparate groups together in a consensus working group for the Port's Future Study, and it included passionate groups from suburbs, my colleagues, but it included the trucking industry, it included all the freight industry, and included the ports. And we concluded and presented to council a Port's Future Study, and I'm going to now get Shane to speak to the highlights of that.
So just very brief background, I'm a consulting economist with 18 years experience. I've written most of Auckland's economic development strategies, and so while I represent a group of disparate people here, my personal view around this is very much a long-term economic development argument around Auckland's waterfront. So in terms of context, the three of us up here sat on the Port Future Study, which took around a year to complete and had a disparate range of views around the table, but we reached a consensus, and the key points of that consensus were, at the outset, we acknowledged that there was a growing tension between the port, which is essentially an industrial activity, and the CBD, which is about people. And that tension was growing because they were competing for space, and there was competition for space not only in the port precinct but in particular around it, and the effects of having a port in a place that is focused on people. It also concluded that the port will not be able to accommodate the long-term freight task, and that was a profound finding of that study. And it determined, as a result of all of that evidence, that there should be a port relocation strategy developed and an alternative port location determined pretty much as soon as possible, acknowledging that moving a port takes a long time, and that if there is already tension between the CBD and the port, we need to start planning now so that we have certainty going forward to protect corridors and do everything we need to do to make that site work. Context, that the port occupies 77 hectares of prime waterfront land at the moment. That equates to around 20% of the CBD, so any aerial shot will give you a sense of how much space is down there. That's approximately twice the size of Wynyard Quarter. And in our view, we're in a really dynamic growth environment. Auckland and New Zealand are in a very special place at the moment in terms of the rest of the world, and our land use patterns have to adapt to the situation we find ourselves in, and the port is part of that discussion. So in terms of waterfront planning, we're here specifically to respond to the plans that were put forward last week by Panuku, which are a further iteration of the Central Wharves strategy, which has been around for quite some time, and was developed a long time before the Port Future Study happened. And in our view, we think those plans need to be realigned to the massive body of thinking and evidence that came out of that process, that Port Future Study process. At the moment, we feel like the current iteration of the Central Wharves strategy is not an evolution of the strategy, it's a small adaptation of it, but that it's still reflective of short-term reactive thinking to things that are immediately present but not thinking longer term, that it also lacks meaningful input from non-council entities, so it's largely been determined in-house on the basis of what council thinks it needs as opposed to what society thinks is required, and we think that it confines development to a very narrow part of the waterfront, and in particular treats the port precinct as out of bounds, and therefore there's not much of the waterfront left when you take the port precinct out of the waterfront, and therefore we're cramming a lot of development into a very small sliver of the waterfront. And our firm view is that what Auckland needs going forward is a 50-year waterfront plan, a very long-looking, forward-looking waterfront plan based on a future in which the port has been relocated, and that changes the game radically for long-term planning. And working backwards from that, it changes the game in terms of what we do in the short to medium term to get towards that long-term future. So what will happen if we move the port? Simply, sea freight will continue to be transacted. It will just be transacted at a different point within Auckland or somewhere close to Auckland. So the freight flows will continue, and all the value associated with the port, or the vast majority, is associated with the freight, not the port that handles the freight. Auckland will avoid billions of dollars of cost. The Port Future Study identified enormous amounts of infrastructure required simply to keep the port operating within a growing CBD environment. That was rail corridors, including competition for commuter rail corridors, roading projects, a whole range of projects that are going to cost billions of dollars just to keep the port operating for a few more years. Knowing that it's going to have to move at some stage, it seems to us that that's money that we won't get back and will not be an optimal use of ratepayer dollars. Major sea and landside issues would be resolved. So at the moment, this tension between CBD and port is very much one of the harbour side, congestion on the harbour. It is about pulling freight through increasingly congested CBD and roading network. And most importantly, we think that Auckland's waterfront, in the absence of a port, could be transformed into something quite spectacular and city-defining. It's twice what Wynyard is. We know how successful Wynyard Quarter has been. We know how the city's responded to it commercially, so forth. That's the prize. And many cities have been through this process. If we don't do it, the freight task is going to grow. We're going to get more of this tension. It's going to escalate. CBD is going to grow. There's going to be more tension. The social licence to operate is already being tested. That's just going to exponentially grow. And even within the 20-year relocation horizon, we're going to have a big problem after 20 years. Billions of payers' ratepayer dollars going to be spent. Port's going to lose market share and become less commercially viable over time, and that undermines the relocation argument. So the sooner we get it done, the better. And we all know that, as with city rail links and everything else, we all wish we'd done it 20 or 30 years ago when it was cheap and easy. Same argument applies here. It will never be cheaper, easier, or more commercially viable to move the port than it is now. So that's the final slide. This is how we think the problem needs to be approached. We think there needs to be a long-term plan, which is the far right up there, which is some vision for Auckland's waterfront, which demonstrates how city-defining and transforming it can be. You sort of work out, that's the benefit, that's the prize. You work backwards from there and say, where's the starting point and what steps do we need to take? This is a roadmap. The first step is securing that alternative port site so that we can move forward with certainty, knowing that we have an alternative freight solution for Auckland, and we can move forward and claim the prize in 20 or 30 years' time for future generations. That's all.
Thank you, Shane. Members, do you have...
That's right. If you wouldn't, can we just, Stephen and I'd like just to, if you wouldn't mind, if we had one more minute. I think the big point that I'd like to make is that the conclusion was that you don't have an option for, at the moment, the conclusion was that the Tauranga and Marsden Point are not capable of taking the load of the freight task over the next few decades, and inherently there will be a new port necessary. And what you need to do, and the obligations, I think, on you as councillors, is to create that option for others. And if you think, and the options could be either in Thames or there might be in Manukau, and the engineers, suggesting either. And I just put to you that if it were in the Manukau by the airport, well then your decision about light rail to the airport might have been different, because if in fact you had decided the future location for the port was in the Manukau, you'd be putting heavy rail, and it would influence your current decisions. So you're not enriching or any of your decisions at the moment with the future inevitability of a new port in Auckland. But Stephen, would you like to make a word?
Stephen?
Thanks, Chris. I'd just like to support, excuse me, everything that has been said before me. I mean, my own personal commercial interests would suggest that we're probably the largest container user of the port as it is. And while commercially that's really important, I think that from a citizen's perspective, having worked in and around the city for 66 years now, that I think it's incredibly important that we look at the beautification of Auckland, the use of the waterfront for the citizens of Auckland, and that we do believe after the study that it is absolutely possible to move this port. So I'm 100% behind the submissions put forward.
Thank you, Stephen. Shane and Richard. We've missed you out, Julie, but you might answer a question, I think.
Well, I'm happy to.
Members, do you have questions of the presenters? Councillor Cashmore.
Thanks, Chris. Team, I recall from the Future Port Study the cost of relocation and building of a new port's upwards in excess of $7 billion. You're talking about the infrastructure costs here, if we're going to retain the port where it is. What was that figure? Do we know?
What, sorry, with
The required infrastructure
Yes,
to
I
retain
understand.
the port, even for 35 years.
Well, first of all, I think that the port is imminently capable of being funded by the private sector. There's a continuum of whether the council should fund it, or in fact it could be funded 100% by the private sector. And so the funding of the port is not actually as big a problem as I think, quite frankly, as funding a relocation of Mount Eden into a stadium. There is, but one of the things that you'll be wrestling with, or your subsequent councils wrestling with, if you're going to put freight, a dedicated freight down into the port from Manukau and additional lines on the rail, that will be redundant after the port moves. If you move the motorway from bottom of Stanley Street and put it across to the port to take the load away, that will be redundant when the port moves. And so the difficulty that you have is that you've got infrastructure to serve the port, but if you keep the port where it is, you're going to spend an enormous amount of infrastructure, as Shane indicated, to maintain the existing asset. And so the expenditures there, potentially you're going to be spending it on a stranded asset. And so but funding the port, because it's a commercial enterprise, just like the airport, as you know, I'm on the board of the airport, I mean, that could easily be funded by the private sector. And so, but others will make the judgment of what equity you need. But I mean, there is the possibility of iwi owning, having the land ownership and leasing the land through to, there's a lot of financial options. And so I wouldn't be frightened by the capital of it, but you've also released enormous economic value in the land itself. So I don't think you should be moving forward feeling that the economics are against this. In fact, I think the Port's Future Study showed the economics are in favour of an early move of the port.
That time of that early move, they were talking about bulk cargo and cars. Was that cars first in bulk cargo? Was it 25 or 35? You just refresh my memory on that?
Well, I think, there's a continuum of time of moving. On the one hand, you might have to, from the port's operational point of view, you move at the time that the port is constrained. From a community point of view, as Stephen's made the point, that you might make a decision that you've built out the Wynyard Quarter, and that the infrastructure that you want for stadiums and things, then the port land is a better use of that, so that this community makes a decision on timing, that it's time for the city to move on. And so even though the port might be able to continue, it's still got ability for, to container efficiency. So there are two competing tensions. It's not a black and white answer about when. And in fact, it will be a political decision. But what you don't have at the moment, you don't have the opportunity to consider that, because you haven't set up a zoning, identified a site and had it zoned. If you were sitting here today and you knew we could make a decision and move it, it would influence all the decisions you're making. So we're not suggesting you're making a decision on time. What we're suggesting and really asking, you must get an option of where that port is, so that your subsequent councillors will then be able to rest with time.
Thank you.
Councillor Simpson, then Meg Goff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So sorry, I'm a bit new to this as a new councillor, so I just want to clarify. You're actually saying not only is it, it's never cheaper to move it as in now, but what you're really saying is you're trying to get us to address that infrastructure cost that we may invest now, based upon where the port currently is, that won't be wasted if it's actually moved. That's what you're really saying, isn't it? You're saying that potentially we could invest
correct.
a whole lot of money to
Yeah.
support the infrastructure around where it is at the moment, where actually, if it moves, that could potentially be wasted.
Yeah, correct. There's one of two paths. Either you can pour a bunch of money into an asset that is coming to the end of its life, and that will be money that you probably won't get back, because it will be dedicated to the operation of a port, and you'll probably have undoing costs thereafter to undo all of that stuff that you did to repurpose the waterfront. Or you could defer that expenditure and point it towards the long-term 100-plus year solution.
So to that end, my second question, Mr Chair, if I may, can you confirm that you've got at least two options in your mind for where a new port site may go that isn't actually Marsden Point or Tauranga?
Yes.
Sorry, the port, if you read the detail, the port study showed that over, within a 50-year time frame, the three ports by themselves cannot deal with the freight task. Even with the growth of Tauranga, growth of Marsden Point, because of all the growth, their own growth, let alone population growth in Auckland. So a new port will be necessary. Now, and so the debate then is only on time.
And location.
And location.
And location. And we've identified too, with our our study was not sufficiently resourced to be definitive about which option. So that is what you need to do as a group.
So the Port Future Study members, and this will be coming back to us, it does identify two locations, Firth of Thames and Manukau, and its recommendations were that comprehensive investigation be undertaken of those locations. So that is a recommendation that came through last June. The former council didn't pick that up. It is upon this council to pick that up, and I take the points raised by Richard about the urgency to do that. You good? Mayor Goff.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I'm interested in your views on what you think the relative merits are of Auckland making a unilateral decision as to where its port might be located, or the merits of a regional approach involving a collective of Tauranga, Auckland and Northport.
I can have a go for that. Richard?
Well, Your Worship, in the future study, we wondered why there wasn't a national port study. I guess at a personal level, my feeling is Auckland has, and I'm sure you must agree with this, we continue to be frustrated by waiting for others to shape our future. I mean, the decision of which, if you were to have another port, where it should go, is entirely your decision. It's a political decision. It's a trade-off of an island port in the Manukau or in the Firth of Thames. I don't see the need for central government to influence your decision on location. Now, central government will influence potentially timing with you. But my personal view is you need to get on with this. And if you wait and engage with others, then you will just, this will just continue to be delayed, and you will not get clarity. And so my personal view is this organisation needs to lead and create an option, and then you will, once you've got that option, you will engage with others. And there was in this, you will see that a discussion in the future port study that it might be, the long term might be a super port, which really is a combination between Tauranga and Auckland. But that's in the sense of its management and potentially its ownership. It's not about the zoning or the need for its location. But Your Worship, you understand the politics of trying to make something happen.
I'm working
I personally support you just getting on and trying to shape Auckland's future, the people in this room.
If I can just clarify the question through you, Mr Chair. There's a tradesmen have a saying, you measure twice and you cut once. We could make a unilateral decision, but we are a small country, and regionally we have the Golden Triangle. Hamilton, Tauranga, Auckland, you can throw in Whangarei. In a country of our size, don't you think it would make sense to examine a port location that works for the region and not simply make a unilateral decision?
Yeah,
if that option is available, it may not be.
And in the port future study, there was a lot of dialogue that occurred with the executive in both at Marsden and in Tauranga as part of it. But look, you're right. If we could get agreement, that is that's an optimum outcome. The difficulty you've got politically is your ability to get agreement, and you're wrestling with all these decisions at the moment.
Thank you.
Mayor Goff, I might just add, 10 years back, I chaired a committee in Wellington called the Growth and Innovation Advisory Board, and one of our key subjects was ports, and there was a lot of work done back then, so that could be dusted off and had another look at, but it was done by central government, but nothing came of it. So we've lost 10 years.
Richard, just a supplementary on the possibility of a regional port strategy, Upper North Island port strategy. Getting political agreement is one thing, as you outlined, but getting commercial agreement how easy would that be, considering you've got 3 commercial ports, one owned entirely by us. Northland, it's got a fragmented ownership structure. And with the Port of Tauranga, majority shareholder with the public entity there, the Bay of Plenty Regional, but it's a publicly listed company, it's just got disclosure requirements. Getting a commercial agreement plus a political agreement, when you line those two up, in your experience, and it's vast,
Look, I think
how realistic?
I think the difficulty you have with commercial organisations is that they always take a short-term view, not a long-term view. Tauranga it has only got a vision for trying to maximise its returns in the short term, and quite frankly, its motivation is to take as much market share from the ports of Auckland as it can, as fast as it can. Yep. So, can they come objectively into a group? And I don't think so, because they will have a short-term objective of commercial gain. So, I think that if you read the detail of the full future study, we tried to cut through all that and try and take the long view. But look, I think the reality, I would not be optimistic personally. When Stephen has had as much experience as I about welding commercial groups together to try and get long-term solutions.
Well, there are different ways of looking at it, obviously, and a lot of it will depend on the propensity of the council to continue to own the port. So I think this is a moving target, but I think if you try to do a deal right now with Tauranga, with the council's ownership, it would be quite difficult, as Richard has outlined. Short-term returns are all that public companies are looking for.
Thank you. And Councillor Clow?
I must admit, all my questions were going to relate to exactly what Mayor Goff was asking, because I'm certainly one of the prime proponents for us to look at trying to have a regional, which in effect would be a national port study, because we have tentacles, all of us, through the country.
Pose the question, please.
The question is, if the ports of Auckland at the moment, who may or may not have a plan to be doing some development on Jellicoe Wharf to effectively hide the cars, you would be saying that is a waste of money?
Look, I'm not sure it's a waste of money in the short term. It's a visual amenity argument, and I guess it's a utilisation of space argument. It might allow them to use exist within their existing footprint for longer. We're supportive of things that take pressure off them coming and asking for more seabed. But in the longer term, our argument is that using our waterfront as an industrial zone is an incredibly low productivity use of land that has an extremely high opportunity cost. And you only need to look at the financial records of the port to understand that they use 77 hectares of land to generate the same amount of profit as the new Datacom building in Wynyard Quarterwell. That's the reality. And the Datacom building occupies probably a quarter of a hectare, and they occupy 77. So our argument is not in the short term, if they want to use mitigation techniques to make it a bit more bearable for Aucklanders to have an industrial zone on their waterfront, so be it. That's at their expense and that's their commercial decision. But in the longer term, we're arguing for a better economic future for Auckland by unlocking that 77 hectares of economic potential and turning it from essentially the productivity of a farm into the productivity of a Wynyard Quarter.
But as the total shareholder, it's actually at our expense, so I think the thoughts are to build on top, but it would be deconstruction later on, which seems frivolous.
Yeah. Councillor Wayne Walker?
Yeah, it's really just a follow-on question from that of Goff and Clow, and that's around your interest in assisting us to formulate something on a regional basis, even with the blocks and the difficulties that you mentioned. And my rationale around that is it's inescapable.
Sorry, what is the question? Are they willing to assist us?
Yes,
I think they're here and they are very willing to assist us.
Yeah, we'll confirm that.
Focusing on the regional approach.
Shane or
Look,
Julie?
there's not, everybody, of course, will be wanting to assist council in this way, and so all of us, I'm sure, we're passionate Aucklanders, and look, it's a big task, and it will need the community, the business community, and all elements to participate with council, and there will be a huge willingness.
I'd just like to add too that the Port's Future Study, the one big thing that I got out of it was how important it was to get everybody around the table talking about it, and it was amazing how having that discussion, how in time people who had a completely disparate point of view actually came to the same opinion, and it was most positive and a great way forward for Auckland. Thank
So
you.
that's a yes.
Thank you, Julie, and thank for Urban Auckland, Shane for Stop Stealing Our Harbour, Richard, thank you so much, Sir Stephen, thank you so much, and I will move receipt of the public input presentation from Shane, Richard, Sir Stephen and Julie. Do I have a second? In Councillor Simpson? And I'll move that. All those in favour say aye, contrary no, declare that carried. Thank you all. Appreciate it.